All right, man, peace. As most of you brothers who've been on my platform for a while know, I mentioned in the past, when it comes to Major League Baseball, I used to follow baseball as closely as any other sport in the 90s because that really was the last gasp for the supremacy or the dominance of the so-called black, or at least so-called black American baseball player. Now, in the course of the last 15 years or so, Major League Baseball has at least acted as if they wanted to make these great strides in race relations because they're concerned about the dearth of so-called black American baseball players in the major leagues. They're trying to figure out why that's the case. As usual, the reason why they're unable to solve the problem is because they're not addressing the root cause of the problem. They're only addressing the branch. The branch is, we don't have enough ambassadors to reach out to young athletes to encourage them to play baseball. But the fact of the matter is that the reason why the amount and the percentage of quote-unquote black American players has declined so much in the last 15 years is because of the systematic destruction of the patriarchal aspect in the so-called black community. And what I mean by that is this. Anyone who understands baseball knows that of all sports, even though football is viewed as being the paragon of masculinity, baseball has always been viewed as the sport that's used to bond father and son. When a father and son went to the baseball game, baseball is a very methodical sport. It's a lot like chess. When it comes to the three major sports, at least the three major American team sports, baseball is the most chess-like. It takes the most methodology. It takes the most cognitive function. You have to think out what you're going to do and what your opponent's going to do more than any other sport. A team that's well coached and well strategized can beat a team with more talent, which is very rarely the case in football or basketball. In football or basketball, the best team in those leagues oftentimes is the best coach, yes, but also has the best athletes who know how to use what they do well. They're put in great positions, yes, but also that athletic factor has to be there. And baseball, of course, has to be there to a degree, and your skill set has to be up to par. But baseball is very chess-like. And when a father and son attend a baseball game, it gives them time to bond and understand the game. If you ever watched many of the great baseball films that were released in the 1970s and 80s, they customarily revolved around the bond of a male figure, a male authority figure, or a master and an apprentice. It could be father and son. It could be veteran and rookie. Kevin Costner came into great fame in the late 1980s because he starred in back-to-back very renowned baseball films. I believe one was Field of Dreams and the other was Bull Durham, starring Tim Robbins. Now, in Bull Durham, Kevin Costner played the master. He was the catcher. His job was to guide the young pitcher, Tim Robbins. In Field of Dreams, Kevin Costner played the son searching to reconnect with his dad. In baseball, we all know, one of the main functions of baseball, as I've already stated, is forming that bond between father and son in a game of catch. I remember being 13 years old, my dad taking me. There was no baseball field around, but we go to the asphalt, where the basketball courts were. But, some asphalt parks in New York, they have that large space where certain people might play softball. And of course, there you could practice your fielding, your hitting, so on and so forth. And that's what we do. Baseball has always been a sport of father and son. So that's why you'll notice that in that last generation of great baseball player, they normally started from the late 80s or into the early 90s, whether it be Barry Bonds, Ken Griffey Jr., Mo Vaughn, Greg Vaughn, Albert Bell, Marquise Grissom, Delano DeShields. The list goes on and on. Maybe from the mid 80s into the early 90s is when that last generation of great black baseball player came into the major leagues. Well, what broke that was when the crack epidemic started in the early 80s, because most of those baseball players, that last generation of great quote-unquote black American baseball player, were born in the late 60s to early 70s, which was before the crack epidemic. So they came into the majors from the late 80s into the early 90s. What you'll notice is that most of the people who were born in the 80s during the crack epidemic, they were raised in single mother households. So they were never raised to understand the game of baseball. Everything during that time period was basketball, basketball, basketball. That's where you get the Allen Iversons from, right? That's where you get the Kevin Garnett's from, and even the Chris Webbers to a degree, like the Fab Five. They pretty much they grew up at the start of the crack epidemic, where there were not as many fathers. Now, Chris Webber, of course, grew up with his dad, but the point being is that most of the athletes that started to come into sports from the mid-90s into the late 90s and onward were raised during the crack epidemic, which totally destroyed that connection between father and son, that patriarchal connection. And of course, that meant the marginalization of baseball. Now we're moving towards basketball. Basketball is more fast-paced. It attracts the woman more. Therefore, if she's leading the household, that's what she's going to steer her son to. As well as football, of course. Because football was something that when the so-called young black man was looking to feel more masculine, he went out for football because it was easier to learn. It was based in more athleticism. Baseball's tougher to learn because it takes more patience. If you don't have a male figure there to explain the game of baseball to you, baseball is an acquired taste. So once the so-called black man was removed from the home in the 80s, hard body in the 80s, I mean, it started earlier than that, where the so-called black man was removed from the home. That started in like the late 60s into the 70s. But when crack hit the so-called black community in the 80s, that's when you saw the obliteration of the quote-unquote black family structure. So that's why you'll notice that most of the athletes that came into professional sports from the mid to late 90s onward, they gravitated towards basketball and football as opposed to baseball. Once again, baseball has always been associated with the paternalistic aspect or the patriarchal aspect. So until they correct that, the so-called black American man is not going to return to baseball. I don't care about how many ambassadors they introduce into this conversation. It could be Barry Bonds, it could be Ken Griffey. Until the so-called black man is back in control of the household, you're not going to see as many so-called black American dominant athletes in the sport. Just my view of it. So anyway, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
Back to the show. Huge news out of Major League Baseball where Ken Griffey Jr., one of my favorite players ever growing up. I love this guy. He was spectacular on.
There's never been a baseball player in the history of professional baseball who was as exciting as Ken Griffey Jr. was in his prime. I don't give a shit what anybody says. Once again, 1990s baseball was as exciting as any other sport. That's when their ratings were the highest. And it was also the time period where you had outstanding black athletes in Major League Baseball. I remember being in high school. The Seattle Mariners would come into Yankee Stadium, and it would be a 3-game series or a 4-game series. And this dude, Ken Griffey Jr., he'd come into Yankee Stadium over 3 games. That motherfucker would hit 4 or 5 home runs in those 3 games. I remember one game he had 3 home runs in one game. And of course, you know, and this is an old story. He recently retold it when he appeared on the Shannon Sharpe show on Club Shay Shay. The experiences that he had as a kid when his father was a member of the New York Yankees, and how he felt that there was some basis in racism in the way in which he was treated as a kid. And he held on to that into his adulthood. He used to dominate the Yankees. And we all remember what happened in the 1995 Major League Baseball playoffs when Seattle defeated the Yankees. I think Seattle was down 2-0 in a 5-game series, and they won the last 3 games, if I remember correctly. And of course, in Game 5, Ken Griffey Jr. rounded the bases from first base, and I can't imagine a person rounding third faster than this dude did to score the game-winning run. Now, unfortunately for the Seattle Mariners, they had no closer. If the Seattle Mariners had had Mariano Rivera, they would have won 3 or 4 straight titles in the 90s. Because they used to win 90 games a season for about 3 years in a row, and they would have the most blown saves in the major leagues. There was a point where they had Alex Rodriguez, Edgar Martinez, Ken Griffey Jr., Jay Buhner, back to back to back to back. I mean, they had the most murderous lineup in major leagues. Edgar Martinez, Ken Griffey Jr., Jay Buhner, back to back to back to back. They had the most murderous lineup in the major leagues, other than maybe the Yankees, who had a more methodical, cerebral lineup. But the Seattle Mariners lineup was incredible in the mid-90s. It was like them, the Cleveland Indians, who had Kenny Lofton, Carlos Baerga, Jim Thome, Albert Bell. Like, I'm just trying to remember a lot of these lineups and these names, man. But 90s baseball was the shit. And once again, the reason why you don't see as many so-called black men in baseball like you did back then was because that era baseball player, the 1990s so-called black player, that was the last generation of baseball player that had a deep connection to the patriarchal aspect of baseball. Most of them were introduced to it by their dads. If you saw the Last Dance documentary, you'll see that Michael Jordan and his brother Larry stated that when they were kids, they thought that they were going to become Major League Baseball players. Because during that time period, basketball was fun, but the top team sport was considered to be baseball in the 70s. It really wasn't until Magic and Bird came into the NBA in the 80s that, they really started to attract the top black athletes, because most of those guys, most of the brothers back in the 70s want to play baseball, because the heroes in the 60s athletically were mostly in baseball. Ernie Banks, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, so on and so forth, Roberto Clemente. Clemente said, "I'm a double nigger. I speak Spanish and I'm black." That's what he said.
One of the most exciting players in baseball history, in my professional opinion, has now been named as a senior advisor to Major League Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred. And one of the jobs that he's going to be tasked with in this new role is super serious, super important. It's improving diversity at amateur levels of the game. Because
I have news for you. Until the so-called black man is back in control over his household and can teach a methodical nature to his son, there will be no return of the so-called black male athlete en masse into the major leagues. Now, I know that there's Mookie Betts and a couple other so-called black men in the major leagues, but for the most part, it's nowhere close to what it was back in the 90s. And as we can see here, I'm guessing that this was in Seattle. Ken Griffey is one of the most loved athletes of all time. He was, let me tell you something, in the 90s, he was as exciting to watch in baseball as Jordan was in basketball. Like, he really was. He was unbelievable.
Baseball's got a huge diversity problem. As a matter of fact, in 2020 on opening day, more than 50% of all players are white, and only 7.8% of players on all rosters were black.
And of course, Ken Griffey Jr.'s dad played in the major leagues. Barry Bonds' dad played in the major leagues. The best pure hitter, in my view, ever, Tony Gwynn. He was great at basketball. I think he played at San Diego State in college. But he ended up choosing baseball and becoming a Hall of Famer.
Baseball is acknowledging that there is an issue here, and they want to fix it. They want more black players in the game of baseball, and so they're tapping people like Ken Griffey Jr. to say, hey, what can we do to improve this? And
I can tell you what can be done, but it's not going to get done because nobody wants to offend women. And I mean, this is so deep-rooted and like so foundational. Not only will it never get accomplished, it won't even get broached because most people don't think on that level. People don't make the connection between baseball and the patriarchal aspect. And what's one of the main themes of modern day society? Destroy the patriarchy. So if you're focused on destroying the patriarchy, which is fatherhood, and you have a community like the so-called black community where the so-called black man has had a lot of his authority taken away from him, how are you going to increase the numbers of so-called black males involved in baseball when baseball has always been associated with the father and the son?
Because I feel like Ken Griffey Jr., he's 51 years old now, which is still shocking to me because I still, whenever I think of Ken Griffey Jr., I think of him as like that, 20-something-year-old kid.
Yeah, it was called the Kid. Ken Griffey Jr. was the person who brought the backwards hat wearing into the major leagues. He did that. He used to do that shit back in the early 90s, man. They used to get tight with him. But he has such a charismatic personality that people got over it.
He was running around the outfield and scaling the wall. I mean, he was an amazing athlete.
His defensive highlights are even better than his offensive highlights. He was the best two-way player in the major leagues for 10 years. Barry Bonds was great all around, but Barry Bonds' weakness is that he had a weak arm. So he tried to compensate for it by having a quick release. Ken Griffey Jr. had a powerful throwing arm from center field.
Now he's a wise older man. Do you think he's got what it takes to help kind of fix the issue here, or at least make it better?
And by the way, the last name Griffey is a Welsh last name. I did a video a very long time ago called Welsh Names Equal Black Names. Last names like Jones, Williams, Griffith, Griffey. These are all so-called black names, or considered so-called black names to this day. Thomas. These are all quote-unquote Welsh last names that are considered so-called black last names.
I like that they're trying to make it better. You know, like, I like the fact that they're taking the initiative, hiring someone like, all right, I do see a little bit of a problem here. Let's address it. And so, yeah, I agree with you too, Evan. Whenever I see superstars, it's like I expect them to be the superstar in primetime shape, in the form that we saw them in. And so when superstars get old, it's...
Yo, Ken Griffey Jr. made a catch in Detroit. You know, you brothers might be able to look this up. He made a catch in Detroit at Old Tiger Stadium, where it looked like he jumped and then stopped in the air for about a tenth of a second and then started to rise up higher and higher. It's one of the best defensive highlights I've ever seen. It was in Detroit in the mid-90s.
Weird. It is weird. But I just think that I like that they're taking the first steps. And absolutely, you know, when you take on a role like that, I know he's going to take it serious because it's a big deal. And so, yeah, I think that good things will come from it.
Yeah, there's no way that he can solve this issue by himself.
And, of course, they show a little clip here of Ken Griffey Jr. with his dad. The elder brother in front of him walking was his father.
I mean, it's impossible. Nobody could. But think back to Ken Griffey Jr. He was cool.
And Ken Griffey Jr. and Sr. were the first father and son pairing to play on the same team together, something that LeBron is trying to mimic or will attempt to mimic with the LA Lakers in 2023.
Baseball has a coolness problem. They have a diversity problem.
Now, when he says that baseball has a coolness problem, what he really means is baseball does not have enough so-called black American men in their sport. That's what that's code word for, coolness problem.
This problem, and they have an age problem. A lot of baseball fans, as opposed to other sports, are older, and they're getting older and older and older.
Okay, this photo is a bit of a pause. I mean, what's going on here? I gotta hug that goddamn tight.
That number is going in the wrong direction. So they need to reach young people, and I think, although he's in his 50s now, I think Ken Griffey Jr. was a really cool person. I think people remember that, and I do think he will make a big difference here, as much as one single person possibly ever could.
And you know what? To my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Babcock, but to my knowledge, never involved in any sort of the steroid scandal stuff.
That's the exact reason why he has such a high voting percentage when he was inaugurated into the Hall of Fame, because he was never associated with the steroids. Ken Griffey Jr. ended his career with over 600 home runs. Had he taken that same shit that Barry Bonds or Mark McGwire were on, he would have hit 850, maybe even 900 home runs, because he had a severe injury problem down the stretch of his career. Part of that also was that, you know, the brother didn't keep himself in the best shape. Had he been as obsessed with his fitness and his conditioning as some of the other athletes, even without the roids, he probably would have hit 800 home runs.
This was a guy who hit bombs and was never once connected to the same steroid stuff that, you know, wrapped up people like Barry Bonds and Mark McGwire.
And probably one of the top 3 to 5 most talented, just physically talented players to ever have existed.
You're right, Babcock.
If you're talking about the most physically talented players to have ever existed, you're talking about Ken Griffey Jr., Willie Mays, and probably Mike Trout, and also Mickey Mantle. Well, you're talking about 5'2" players who did all 5 things at the highest level.
So look, best of luck to Ken Griffey Jr. We're rooting for you. We really are. And if anybody can make a difference, man, it's you.
Let's go!
Well, I don't think that Ken Griffey's going to make much of a difference in this situation because it's much deeper than anything that he can handle. But once again, it's impossible to solve a problem if you don't want to acknowledge the problem. People speak out of both sides of their mouths. They love talking about the lack of quote-unquote black fathers, but they refuse to acknowledge that in a household you have to have an understanding and an acceptance of gender roles. Since the woman has been empowered to join the corporate workforce as a part of feminism, she no longer believes in or adheres to her ancestral and historical gender role, no matter what they say. So at the end of the day, there's always going to be an imbalance there. And the crack epidemic has caused irreparable damage to the so-called household within the so-called black community. Because once again, both household and black community have to be placed in quotes. Because most women today do not know how to even abide in a household with a man. They have no idea how to do it, no matter what they say. But what's becoming more and more common, especially with this younger generation of female, is for them to admit and acknowledge that I don't even really want a man. I just want his sperm. I just want to have fun with him for a moment, because this Western society has been so deculturalized I'm not going to go off on a tangent too much. The point of the video was that in order for baseball to be the recipients of the great black American talent, they're going to have to work towards building up the quote-unquote black family structure, and they're not going to do that. So peace.